Welcome to this week's podcast. I'm Stuart McCullough. I'm the CEO of VHIA. And joining me for this week's discussion is the Director of Workplace Relations Services, Tim Nagel. Welcome, Tim.
Thanks, Stuart. Good to be here.
Tim, today we're continuing our implementation series focusing on Clause 57 annual leave of the new Nurses and Midwives Agreement.
To state the obvious, it's not a new provision, but there have been some amendments to the existing clause.
So before we even get to subclause 1 of Clause 57, there's an exclusion.
Yes. So under the title, it states clearly that the clause does not apply to casual employees.
Okay, so if you're a casual employee watching this podcast, it's best to look away now. There's nothing here for you. But for everyone else, let's move on to subclause 1.
Which is entitled Entitlement to Annual Leave. It sets out the entitlement in 3 elements. The first is Clause 57.1a, which states as follows. An employee is entitled to 190 hours paid annual leave for each year of service.
And for part-timers, that applies on a pro rata basis.
That's correct. So subclause A outlines what I would describe as the base entitlement. There's a further entitlement for weekend workers at subclause B. So a weekend worker is entitled to a further 38 hours paid annual leave for each year of service as follows.
Okay, so a further 38 hours in that circumstance, a further week.
Yes, that's right. So the clause then describes how this accrues for full and part-time employees as follows. So you can see on the screen there for full-time employees at the rate of 3 hours for each week in which ordinary hours were worked on a weekend or part thereof, up to a maximum of 38 hours. So 10 weekends to get there.
All right, so this specifies both a rate of accrual and a cap.
And it's triggered by work on a weekend or part of a weekend.
So, Tim, why specify part of a weekend?
That you might work some hours on a Saturday and not also on Sunday, but you still qualify. You don't need to perform hours on both weekend days. There's also information about part-time employees within the clause, and it reads, as you can see on screen there, for part-time employees, as a proportion of 3.8 hours for each week in which ordinary hours were worked on a weekend or part thereof, up to a maximum of 10 weekends. And you can see there that there's an example. So if a part-time employee who works 24 hours on a weekend, that includes a weekend.
So, Tim, this is a provision that has been modified in the most recent agreement, and it was modified based on member feedback.
It was. The previous agreement mirrored existing provisions in other agreements, but members subsequently advised that this was done manually, creating an issue when the pool of employees was increased.
So in terms of that modification for accrual for part-time employees, we developed a discussion paper that had options. We provided it then to the Nurses and Midwives reference group and then proceeded to provide that as part of the bargaining process.
Yeah, and we got very useful feedback from the reference group on that paper, which helped us settle the model.
But it's worth emphasising that the modification here was to create something that could be automated, rather than increase or reduce the entitlement itself. That in turn takes us on to subclause C.
So that describes how it accrues. So you can see on screen, annual leave accrues progressively during a year of service according to the employee's ordinary hours of work and accumulates from year to year.
Just in terms of that term, accruing progressively, when we talk about accruing progressively, as opposed to what other model?
So as opposed to becoming entitled to all of it once upon the completion of 12 months service. So instead of getting it all at once, it accrues as you go through that year.
And within that clause, Tim, if we go a step below, there is a savings provision.
Yes, because the method changed into 2020 to remove ambiguity, there was the possibility that an employee who had been entitled may no longer be entitled.
All right, so the effect of the savings provision is to maintain the entitlement until certain events occur, such as a change in role.
That's correct.
All right, so accruing annual leave is one thing, But as we all know, it's not much good unless you take it, which brings us to subclause 2.
Yeah, so there's 6 elements here to cover before we get into the high demand periods. But if we start at the beginning, which is a good place to start, 57.2, taking of paid annual leave, initially says the following at A. Paid annual leave may be taken for a period agreed between the employee and their employer.
So agreed is an interesting component.
It is, but subclause B provides some balance to A. So B reads, the employer must not unreasonably refuse to agree to a request by the employee to take paid annual leave.
So what that means is that refusal is not something that's arbitrary. And I take it that what is reasonable or unreasonable in the context of the clause will turn on the specific circumstances.
That's right. So sometimes a member might ask what reasonable means, but it's very much an evaluation of a specific circumstance. So subclause C provides the following. The employer must publish how an employee is to make an annual leave request.
So, what does publishing how an employee is to make an annual leave request mean in a practical sense?
Well, in a practical sense, it means that you told people how to apply for their annual leave. For the clause to work, it requires the employees know what the employer's process is and follow that process so that everyone's on the same page.
And I wouldn't imagine that that was a common problem, but it could be a problem in some isolated instances, hence that clarification. Tim, that takes us then to subclause D.
Which provides the following. Once annual leave is approved, it must not be unilaterally changed by the employer. Where extraordinary circumstances arise, such that the employer wishes the employee to change the timing of their approved leave, any change may only occur through consultation and agreement.
So I assume that provision is really seeking to state that people are entitled to rely on the approval of their leave and will likely incur expenses on that basis.
Yeah, this is a new provision, but it should be noted that we did experience some fairly extraordinary times during the pandemic when workforce shortages were particularly acute. But essentially, you're right. People will book holidays, they'll book flights, they'll expend money in anticipation that they'll be able to take their annual leave that was approved.
What if an employer is going to reject an application because, for example, a large number of people have already had leave approved for the same period?
Yes, the subclause E is relevant to that particular scenario. So you can see it on screen there, where it is likely the leave request will be rejected. The employer and employee will consult on alternative leave days within the 10-day period, or in the case of a high demand holiday period, the period between the dates specified at those two subclauses.
So I'm mindful that employers and employees have a shared interest in making sure that leave is being taken. The provision is directed to ensuring that alternatives are considered rather than a flat out refusal.
Yes, it may be that there are some days that are problematic and others that aren't, and a modified application can be approved. So it's really about trying to find how both parties can be accommodated in the requests.
And subclause F really goes to the issue of timing.
It does. Specifically, it provides at F where the paid annual leave is for a period other than a high demand holiday period. The employee will submit a written request for annual leave at least 6 weeks prior to the first date of the proposed leave period, unless it is not reasonable to do so in those circumstances. And secondly, within 10 weekdays of the leave request, the employer will notify the employee in writing that their annual leave request is approved, or if not approved, the reasons for the leave not being approved.
That's interesting in the sense that that provision really connects to that earlier requirement that the employer publish how a request for leave is to be made, as those timeframes really depend on it. The requirement on the employee to submit a written request at least 6 weeks in advance, unless it is not reasonable in the circumstances to do so. What does that phrase mean?
Yeah, so look, sometimes, I mean, life happens. Sometimes people will make annual leave applications at short or shortish notice because something's happened. This accommodates those circumstances.
All right, so applications with a lesser period, a lesser lead-in period, that's not prohibited.
No, a person can make an application at any time, but it may, of course, impact the likelihood of it being approved. But as I said earlier, having employees take annual leave is a shared interest.
Yeah. I do know that the provision begins by saying that it's with respect to a period that's other. Uh, well, I'll start that paragraph again, having regard for the lighting. Let's see, 1004. Um, Tim, I do note that the provision begins by saying that it's with respect to a period other than a high demand holiday period, which leads to the obvious question, what is a high demand holiday period? And what are the rules regarding the managing of applications for those periods?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. So a high demand holiday period is one where you know that you'll get more applications than you can approve. Although what those periods may vary from ward to ward depending on the demographics, depending on the period of time that the unit operates.
All right. So for some units, a high demand period might be a school holiday period, for example, but that may not be the case in another ward because the needs of the staff in that ward are different.
Exactly. So subclause D provides some rules around that process. So you can see on screen, the employer will develop and publish to affected employees, which may be a specific ward or work area, requirements for a high demand holiday period. Where this occurs, the requirement must identify the high demand holiday period, identify the date by which a written request for annual leave should be submitted, and identify the date by which the employer will notify the employee in writing that their annual leave request is approved, or if not approved, the reasons for the leave not being approved.
All right. So this is not a new term, but it's worth pointing out that it's directed at ensuring people can have their applications considered fairly and that you don't get people missing out because someone else has put their application in a year or 2 years in advance.
Exactly. As the clause goes on to talk about how to handle such applications. And you can see on screen there the wording. In determining applications for high demand periods, the employer will consider all the circumstances, including but not limited to A, the employee's operational needs, B, the employee's family responsibilities, and finally at C, whether previous leave applications for the same high demand period were or were not successful.
And Tim, the agreement also includes an example which is instructive.
Yes, it provides the example on screen. So, ward generally receives more applications for annual leave over school term breaks than it can accommodate. This means that school term breaks are high demand periods for that ward within the meaning of this subclause, and the NUM or MUM must publish the information specified above at the subclause. When determining the applications, apply the considerations at subclause 57.2F Roman numeral 2.
So subclauses 3 and 4 deal with excess annual leave provisions. What is an excess annual leave accrual?
It's more than 2 years' worth of accrual or annual leave accrual, noting that a year's worth of accrual is different for a weekend worker.
All right, so we could get lost in those provisions, but it is probably enough just to summarize those subclauses. But they essentially impose an obligation to try and reach agreement on reducing the leave balance over a period of time. And if the process is exhausted without agreement, then in that limited circumstance, the ability to direct someone to take leave.
Yes, but it should be noted that there are also some circumstances where an employee can give notice that they'll be taking leave, which can't be refused.
Yes, it goes both ways. The message there for everyone is that excess leave accruals shouldn't be ignored.
And that reaching an agreement is much better than either party giving notice to the other.
And for the sake of completeness, disputes over plans, directions, the requirement to confer under those excess leave provisions, they can all go to the Commission. But that's an overview of subclauses 3 and 4. And if a member has an issue with that um, uh, involving excess leave accruals, please do contact us. Tim, though, that takes us to subclause 5.
Yeah, you can see on screen there the wording of 57.5, short periods of annual leave. So, paid annual leave under this clause can be taken in periods less than an employee's ordinary fortnight. So, that's referred to as a short period, including single days, in which case any notice period may be waived by agreement.
I'll simply emphasize at the start that I'm glad that the clause emphasised that it's the period of time that is short, rather than the person taking the annual leave as such.
Yeah.
I am mindful of our previous discussions about short shifts. Um, that does connect to what we were saying before, though, Tim, that not applying 6 weeks in advance is not a breach of the agreement.
And that people will want to take leave at short notice sometimes, and that's certainly how the NES operates, for instance.
Yes. One thing that can be confusing, though, is how a period of leave interacts with other things, specifically public holidays or leave that's taken because a certain event happens, specifically personal leave or compassionate leave.
Yeah, so this is addressed at subclause 6. And you can see the specific words on the screen there. So employees are not taken to be on paid annual leave at certain times. So the first of those is at A, public holidays. If the employee takes paid annual leave during a period that includes a public holiday, the employee is taken not to be on paid annual leave on that day.
All right. So to take a simple illustration, if I work Monday to Friday and I put in for a week of leave beginning on the Monday and ending on the Friday, a public holiday falls on that Friday, then I am not on annual leave on that Friday.
Correct.
What if I don't normally work on the Friday?
You wouldn't have been on annual leave for a day you don't work, so it shouldn't be an issue.
All right. And what about personal and compassionate leave?
So that's addressed by subclause B, which provides the words on screen, other periods of leave. And it also makes a reference back to 61 personal leave and 65 compassionate leave. But what this subclause says is that an employee may take other types of leave, such as personal leave or compassionate leave, whilst on annual leave. An employee is taken not to be on paid annual leave whilst on the other leave, and the employee's paid annual leave accrual will be amended to reflect this. These provisions, however, do not apply to unpaid parental leave.
So these examples with regards to personal leave and so on, these types of leave in effect take precedence over annual leave. If you do go on personal leave during annual leave, what evidence do you need to provide your employer?
So the clause makes it clear that the rules under the personal leave still apply. So an employee taking personal leave whilst on annual leave will provide the employee with evidence in accordance with clause 61, which is the personal leave clause.
So there is a practical consideration with that, Tim. What if you go on a period of annual leave and then get sick and seek to change that to personal leave? What happens if annual leave loading has already been paid?
So it's simply treated as having been paid in advance. So it's not retrieved from the employee. Is that it doesn't have to be paid again. So you can see on screen the actual provisions of the clause where it says where an employee takes other leave during annual leave, any annual leave loading received for a period that is no longer annual leave is taken to have been paid in advance as required by clause 57.7, which is the payment for leave clause, and may be deducted from any payment required to be made under subclause 57.11a, which is the effect on termination on annual leave. So in effect, it's taken as to be paid in advance.
All right. So far we've talked about the accrual of leave, the taking of leave, but what we haven't talked about is payment for leave.
Yeah, so that's addressed at subclause 7. You can see the words on screen there. So employees will receive their ordinary pay and any amounts required by clause 57.8, which is the annual leave loading or penalties subclause, during periods of annual leave. Ordinary pay for the purpose of this clause means remuneration for the employee's normal weekly number of hours of work calculated at the ordinary time rate of pay, provided that 1, where an employee has performed higher duties for an aggregate period of 3 months or more in a 12-month period, ordinary pay will be adjusted proportionally to reflect the period during which higher duties were performed. And secondly, at Roman numeral 2, normal weekly hours for a part-time employee who performs additional shifts will reflect the additional hours worked over the 12-month period.
All right. So a term like ordinary pay, I understand, but any amount required by 57.8 is something of a cliffhanger.
Yeah, we'll get to it, but that's the amount the clause goes on to specify when the payment is to be made. So payment for paid annual leave will be in advance for the periods of such leave except for a short period.
All right. So no more waiting. That does bring us to subclause 8.
which provides that in addition to ordinary pay, employees will receive either annual leave loading or penalties.
All right. Now, there is a change in this part that we should highlight.
There is, and it concerns the amount of leave that attracts leave loading.
And bearing in mind that the group who attracts leave loading instead of penalties are probably the minority and that they are an identifiable group.
Yeah, so the penalties option isn't capped, but leave loading does have a cap. So that cap, in effect, is for 4 weeks and it's been increased to 5 weeks under the new agreement.
And members can find more information on that change in the implementation guide. And for those who are unfamiliar with how to access an implementation guide, you can find it on the landing page for this agreement.
Yes, that's right. And just for completeness, we have the provision on screen, as you can see. So, in addition to ordinary pay, as defined, an employee will receive the higher of either Roman numeral 1, leave loading of 17.5%, calculated on the relevant rate of salary prescribed in Appendix 2, subject to the cap at 57.9, or alternatively, at Roman numeral 2, the payments listed below which the employee would have received had the employee not been on leave. So those include the shift allowance, special rates for Saturdays and Sundays, qualification allowance, uniform allowance, and the ripen allowance. And then at B, from the 1st of June 2024, leave loading under subclause 57.7A1 is payable on the maximum of 190 hours in respect of any year of employment, and the employee's weekly ordinary pay subject to the cap as defined.
The cap is defined. So, Tim, we have an intriguing reference to the cap as defined.
We do, which takes us to the cap. So that's located at 57.9, and what that says is the cap under subclause 57.8b Roman numeral 2 is the weekly rate prescribed by this agreement for an NM5C.
And subclause 10 then sets out the option for determining which allowances a person would have received.
Yeah, so it brings that list back up. As you can see there, the shift allowance, special rates for Saturdays and Sundays, qualification allowance, uniform allowance, and ripen allowance.
What's interesting about that list for me is that some are event based and some are not. So if a person gets a uniform or qualification allowance, you know that they would have gotten those things had they not been on leave.
Yeah, for shift allowance and weekend rates, these can be determined either by looking forwards or, if that's not possible, looking backwards. So 57.9.1 sort of goes to that issue, and you can see the words on screen. So to determine which payments the employee would have received had the employee not been on leave, for the purposes of subclause 57.8A Roman numeral 2, this will be done by either A, the projected roster, being the roster the employee would have worked if they had not been on leave, or alternatively at B, where there is no projected roster, the rosters for the 12 weeks immediately preceding the leave, excluding any period during which the employee was not on the roster. So, for example, they were on an approved professional development or other form of paid leave.
So, Tim, we've talked about annual leave accruing as you go. What happens if the employment ends and there's untaken leave, or alternatively, the employee has taken more annual leave than they were entitled to?
Yeah, so any accrual is paid out along with leave loading or penalties, as the case may be, so they're not disadvantaged. And if the employee has a negative balance, it can be deducted from any remuneration payable on termination.
But Tim, and the clause ends by referring to ADOs, simply by referring to the ADO clause. So it just points, it's really more a traffic light or a direction. But thank you for taking us through the annual leave provision of the Nurses and Midwives Agreement as amended.
My pleasure. Thanks, Stuart.